I've opened our old magical interfaces test application that we were working on in the last example and our last presentation. As you can see, I've added a few extra controls here that we'll be using for the next presentation, but for now I'd like to point out a few things that I wasn't able to point out in the other presentation because I was using different recording software, and this is basically for beginners. If you wanted to change the color, you click on your background here, you click on this down arrow to bring up the dialog box, and it wasn't showing that the last time. You could select your colors here. So I could change that to yellow, for example, and change it back to aqua. Okay, so for the next example, I'm going to take a look at the code that we're using here, and we'll notice that there's a red line underneath this line of code, and it says that the static method invoked via derived type. So this isn't really the best way to access the text property of our form, and we're calling it using active form, which means if the form wasn't active, we would get an error. For example, if we were to create a breakpoint here and then attempt to set this when the form was not active, we would get an error. So the reason is that we can call this using this, which references the object that we're in. We're already in main form, and so we don't need to reference it using the explicit name of the form. So I'm going to do what's called commenting out that line of text, which means it won't execute. And I'm going to change the instruction to say this text as opposed to main form, active form text. And I'm going to copy the value that we set it to. Now, comments are used in code to explain what the code is doing. Generally, we would use comments if we were working on something more complicated to explain what we're doing in the code if it isn't immediately obvious, or just to make it easier to understand what the code is doing without having to look at each instruction. So we can just put a comment here that we replaced this with a different instruction for now. And we can also go here, comment this line of code out, and replace it with this text, and then set that to correspond to our yes button. Go ahead and save that, and then execute the application, and we'll see that it works the same way. Now you'll see here that I have another line of code that I decided to use that sets a text box called txt output, and that's this text box here. I can see that that name is being used in the properties window for that text box. It's called txt output. So instead of setting the forms text property, we can set a different control in this case. So we can do that for both of our buttons. So I click the No button, and now the text appears in a text box rather than in the text of the form. So that's it for that example. In the next example, we're going to be looking how to get various values from our text boxes and to add and subtract, as well as looking at how to debug an application and to execute one line of code at a time and then look at various variables as they change.